Before anyone searches for the Antichrist's face, there is a harder question. What if the danger described by the earliest texts is not first a face at all? 1 John says that the spirit of Antichrist is already at work. 1 Enoch tells a separate, ancient story about harmful spirits that remain after the giants die. Neither sentence gives us a secret name, but placed beside one another, they force us to look past the familiar hunt for a future ruler and ask whether an unseen agency can work through a human world without being reduced to one human body. That question needs a boundary from the beginning. First, Enoch never uses the word Antichrist. It does not comment on Revelation, identify a final political leader, or announce that some hidden creature will take a throne. John, meanwhile, does use Antichrist language, but he uses it in letters about deceivers, confession, and communities being pulled away from what they had received. The connection explored here is therefore not a recovered identity card. It is a comparison between two ancient ways of describing destructive influence, one tied to false teaching, the other tied to disembodied spirits. The word Antichrist appears in 1 and 2 John, not in Revelation, Daniel, or 1 Enoch. That detail changes the atmosphere immediately. John is not sketching a monster for readers to recognize on a news broadcast. He warns that many antichrists have appeared and that a spirit opposed to Christ is already present. His concern is intimate and local. People who once belonged to a community then deny the Son and mislead others. The earliest category is not a biography. It is a spiritual and confessional conflict that can become visible in ordinary speech. First, Enoch approaches invisible harm through another door. In the Watcher's narrative, heavenly beings cross a forbidden boundary, giant offspring follow, and those giants eventually die. Chapters 15 and 16 say that evil spirits proceed from their bodies and remain upon the earth. The language is severe. These spirits afflict, oppress, ruin, and wander. Whether a reader receives that account as scripture, ancient tradition, or literature, its function is clear. It supplies an origin story for destructive agency that is no longer attached to a living giant body. That is the first real discovery. Enoch does not say, "This is the Antichrist." John does not say, "The spirit of Antichrist comes from dead giants." Yet both texts refuse a shallow equation between evil and one visible individual. John speaks of a spirit expressed through deceivers. Enoch imagines harmful spirits acting after their original bodies are gone. The overlap is conceptual rather than verbal. It makes room for an ancient reader to distinguish a person who acts, a message that spreads, and an agency believed to animate destruction behind either one. If this investigation helps, subscribe to this channel now, because the next pieces are where the easy answer usually breaks apart. We have to keep 4 different bodies of writing from melting into one dramatic character: John's Antichrists, Paul's man of lawlessness, Revelation's beast and image, and Enoch's spirits. They can be read together in later theology, but they were not written as one dossier. The distinction is not a retreat from the mystery. It is what lets the mystery retain its edges instead of becoming a collage of verses that can mean anything. Paul's man of lawlessness is the next piece commonly folded into the picture. 2 Thessalonians speaks of rebellion, restraint, deception, and a figure revealed in a time of crisis. But Paul does not call that figure Antichrist. He gives us a different title and a different rhetorical setting. Later Christian readers often join Paul's figure to John's language and to Revelation's visions. That joined portrait may be a meaningful interpretation within a tradition. It is still a construction across authors, and it should not be presented as though each author had already supplied every line of the same portrait. Revelation adds the most unforgettable images: a dragon, a beast that receives power and a throne, another beast that persuades, and an image associated with worship and coercion. Those scenes are intense precisely because authority appears to flow from one level to another. The dragon gives, the beast exercises, the image represents and speaks. A reader may see empire, an individual ruler, a cultic order, or a layered combination. The text has generated all of those readings. What it does not do is place an Enochic name in a margin beside the beast. This is where the phrase, not human at all, must be handled carefully. It cannot mean that a human participant is impossible, because biblical apocalyptic literature repeatedly uses visible rulers, cities, bodies, armies, and institutions. The stronger idea is different. A visible person may not exhaust the meaning of the danger. In John's letters, deception can be carried by people without being merely personal ambition. In Revelation, public authority can be given, enacted, and displayed. In Enoch, destructive spirits can act without their former bodies. The proposed reading asks us to consider an invisible dimension, not to erase every human dimension. The manuscript trail also deserves attention because it tells us what kind of document First Enoch is. Aramaic fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls show that substantial Enochic material circulated in ancient Judaism before Christianity. The complete form known today survives principally in Guizi, preserved through Ethiopian Christian tradition. That history is remarkable. It proves antiquity, transmission, and a long life across communities. It does not prove that one lost authority hit a final end times code. A manuscript can be old and still require interpretation, comparison, and restraint. Jude gives another reason Enoch remained important to many readers. The letter echoes and cites Enochic tradition in a warning about judgment. At the same time, the book's status was received differently across Christian communities. Ethiopian Orthodox tradition preserves it as scripture. Most Greek and Latin canonical traditions do not. That varied reception should make us neither dismissive nor reckless. It explains why Enoch sits close to biblical imagination for some believers and outside the canon for others. The story of the book is therefore part of the investigation, not a shortcut around it. Here's the question I would put to you. When later readers combine John, Paul, Revelation, and Enoch, which connection feels strongest to you, and which one needs the most proof? Leave that in the comments. The answer matters because the most tempting step is usually the least examined one. We see a throne in Revelation, a hostile spirit in John, restless spirits in Enoch, and a lawless man in Paul. Then the mind turns 4 images into one biography. Ancient texts often invite patterns. They do not automatically authorize every pattern we can draw. The Watcher's narrative itself requires a distinction that popular retellings often blur. The Watchers are the heavenly beings who transgress. The giants are their offspring. In First Enoch's account, the spirits associated with the dead giants are not simply the Watchers under another name. Their condition, origin, and fate are described differently. That difference matters for the present question. If Enoch is used as an analogy for bodiless harmful agency, the relevant material is not a generic cloud of fallen beings. It is the specific aftermath of the giant's death in that narrative. The Gospels make the ancient world of spirits more imaginable without settling the Enochic question. They portray unclean spirits as speaking, afflicting, and seeking to inhabit or leave bodies. But the Gospels do not identify every unclean spirit as the spirit of a dead giant, and they do not identify those spirits with John's Antichrist language. A careful reader can acknowledge the shared ancient world without flattening it. Similar categories create a field of comparison. They do not erase the particular vocabulary, purposes, and theological arguments of each text. That safeguard matters, especially when modern fears enter the conversation. An image that speaks in Revelation is not automatically a machine. An ancient account of spirits is not automatically a prediction of surveillance, artificial intelligence, or some future technology. Those associations may feel vivid because we live with screens and networks. The ancient writers did not. Their images concern worship, loyalty, authority, deception, violence, and judgment. Reading them responsibly means allowing their own symbolic world to remain strange before we recruit it to explain ours. What then does 1 Enoch really add? It offers an old and unsettling answer to a question many traditions ask. Can destruction be personal without being limited to a person? In its narrative, yes. The dead giants leave behind spirits whose violence continues after the giant bodies are gone. That is not a Christian doctrine of Antichrist written in advance. It is a framework in which bodily appearance and harmful influence can be separated. When John calls attention to a spirit already at work through deceivers, the comparison becomes intelligible, even though the two texts do not make it themselves. The middle of the investigation turns on a simple test. Does similarity of behavior establish identity, or does it only establish a possible analogy? A deceiver in John and a harmful spirit in Enoch may both damage human life, but they inhabit different narratives and carry different purposes. The first speaks to confession about Christ. The second explains the lingering violence of a primordial catastrophe. If we make them identical too quickly, we gain a dramatic answer and lose the evidence. If we refuse every comparison, we lose the way ancient traditions often illuminate one another. The work is to hold both risks at once. That balance changes how we picture a throne. A throne is not just furniture. In biblical imagery, it is a public site of rule, judgment, allegiance, and fear. Revelation says the beast receives authority. It does not ask readers to imagine a vacant chair in isolation. The question is whether the visible bearer of authority is the whole story. Enoch's spirits make a layered answer conceivable. An agency can be unseen while its effects are seen. Revelation's drama of delegated power makes that question sharper. But neither text permits us to name a secret occupant with manuscript-level certainty. There is also a practical consequence for anyone who reads these texts devotionally. The search for a single future face can become a way of avoiding John's nearer warning. John directs attention to truth, confession, and deception within a community. That warning is less cinematic, but perhaps more demanding. It asks how falsehood gains trust, how language reshapes loyalty, and how spiritual opposition can appear in familiar settings. A distant villain can be watched from a safe distance. A pattern of deception asks for discernment in the present, where no dramatic costume announces itself. If this distinction clarifies the subject for someone who has only heard the sensational version, share the video with them. Not because a shared theory needs to win, but because the texts become more interesting when people are allowed to see the seams. John's letters are not Revelation. Revelation is not 2 Thessalonians. 1 Enoch is not a hidden appendix to either one. Their differences do not weaken the investigation. They show exactly where later interpretation begins, where ancient language ends, and where conviction must remain humble. The decisive answer is not a name. It is a more precise answer to the question behind the name. At the textual level, the spirit of Antichrist in John is an opposition already expressed through deceivers and denial. At the Enochic level, harmful spirits are linked to the dead giants and continue their destructive work on earth. At the level of later interpretation, readers may see a pattern in which spiritual hostility can use bodies, messages, institutions, and public authority without being exhausted by any one of them. That is the most that the comparison can responsibly carry. So, is the Antichrist not human at all? First Enoch does not say that. John does not say that. The careful answer is that the oldest relevant texts make a purely human explanation too small for some readers, while still refusing to identify a non-human individual behind every future scenario. They direct attention toward agency, allegiance, and deception rather than a secret portrait. That answer may feel less satisfying than a name, but it is stronger because it keeps the evidence visible. It lets the ancient texts speak in their own voices before we ask them to speak to ours. One reason this distinction has survived is that ancient apocalyptic texts are built from layers. A vision can use a beast to speak about political domination, religious pressure, and spiritual rebellion at once. A letter can address a local dispute while also naming a larger opposition. A story about giants can answer an old question about why violence seems to outlive the violent. Modern readers often want one layer to cancel the others. The documents themselves are less tidy. They keep history, symbol, theology, and imagination close together, which is why responsible reading needs more patience than a single label can offer. That patience also protects the people named in these traditions. It is easy to turn the word Antichrist into a weapon against a rival church, a political enemy, or a stranger whose language feels threatening. John's own warning should make that impulse uncomfortable. His concern is not a license to identify opponents at will. It is a call to examine testimony about Christ and the moral effect of deception. Enoch's violent spirits are equally unsuitable as a tool for accusation. They belong to a narrative of cosmic disorder, not to a method for diagnosing the hidden life of other people. The material evidence gives the investigation a useful humility. The Qumran fragments are not a modern book with neat chapter numbers and explanatory footnotes. They are ancient remains, incomplete and transmitted across centuries. The Ethiopic text preserves a larger whole, but every preserved whole comes through a history of copying, translation, and community. That is not a reason to distrust the text. It is a reason to respect it. The more remarkable the conclusion we want to draw, the more openly we should show the path from fragment to wording to comparison to interpretation. In that sense, careful uncertainty is not an embarrassment. It is the discipline that allows a difficult ancient text to remain difficult instead of making it merely useful to the anxieties of the present. There is a difference between mystery and vagueness. Mystery lets a text retain questions it has not answered. Vagueness uses those unanswered questions to smuggle in any conclusion we prefer. The Enochi comparison remains meaningful because it is specific: dead giants, harmful spirits, a continuing presence on earth. John's language remains specific too: deceivers, denial, a spirit already at work. Once those details are named, the limits become visible. The texts may illuminate a layered account of hostile influence. They do not yield a calendar, a secret species, or a guaranteed identification of a future public figure. That restraint is not the opposite of faith. It can be a form of faithfulness to the words that have actually survived. A reader may still believe the passages speak urgently to the future, but urgency should make us read more closely, not less closely. The alternative is to mistake our appetite for certainty for the voice of the text. That same discipline changes the practical question from "whom must I accuse?" to what kind of allegiance is being demanded. Revelation repeatedly tests worship and endurance. John's letters test confession and truthful witness. Enoch's Watcher's story exposes knowledge and power turned toward violence. Those are not interchangeable plots, yet each directs attention away from spectacle alone and toward the effects of corrupt authority. If an unseen influence is part of the picture, It is recognized through what it produces. Deception that asks to be trusted, power that asks to be worshipped, and violence that presents itself as order. This does not identify a hidden species behind a throne. It gives the comparison moral weight without pretending that analogy has become biography. The visible bearer of power still matters, but the ancient warnings ask whether the loyalty surrounding that bearer has already become larger than one body. If you want more investigations that separate the manuscript from the later interpretation without draining the mystery from either, subscribe to this channel. And tell me below, does the distinction between a visible ruler and an unseen influence change how you read these passages? The most enduring lesson is not to become certain too quickly. In apocalyptic writing, what is hidden is often not a puzzle waiting for a single clever answer. It is an invitation to test every connection before we build a world on it. That practice does not end the mystery. It gives the mystery a firmer ground, where wonder and careful reading can remain together, and where fear cannot quietly replace evidence with a story that merely feels complete.